Welcome to the Indie by Design podcast, a show about great games and their creators. This is episode 14, hosted by me, John Robertson, and today we're talking to Steve Gaynor. Steve is a co-founder of the Fullbright company, the studio behind Gone Home and Tacoma, and he also worked as lead designer on the brilliant Bioshock 2 DLC, Minerva's Den. Before we go into that, we'd just like to remind you of our social media. You can follow Indie by Design to stay up to date with all of our podcasts, our books, our editorial, our videos on Twitter, Facebook and YouTube. That's all at Indie by Design. Just search Indie by Design on those platforms and you'll find us. Or you can go to indiebydesign.net and everything is on there as well. If you'd like to leave us a review on your preferred podcasting platform or subscribe to us on YouTube, then that would be very much appreciated. We'd just also like to remind you that Indie by Design is unfunded, but you can help support us with a few dollars a month by going to our Patreon, which is patreon.com/Indie by Design. Any support is greatly appreciated and it really helps us in keeping the show going, expanding the show and improving upon it. Gone Home was one of the first games upon which the term walking simulator was bestowed. These are games in which you move around an environment, seeking out artefacts and triggering audio and video logs that together tell a story. The interaction comes from the order and the pacing through which you uncover these moments of interest, the resultant depth of understanding determined by how far the player is willing to interpret both the world around them and their own reading of what they've seen. The walking simulator term began life as a smear, an insult created by those who don't consider such games at all. However, creators of the games and fans of them have adopted the term and the genre has thrived since its inception. Here Steve talks to us about the progress that he and his studio Fullbright has made from Gone Home to Tacoma. He also talks about the nature of his games and how they are constructed, and where the games industry and games culture as a whole sits within wider culture. Can games, for example, ever become as culturally relevant as novels or movies? He begins by discussing what it is that both Gone Home and Tacoma share at their core.
The core experience or the core interaction of like you said, there's differences, but the heart of both Gone Home and Tacoma are, that satisfaction of arriving somewhere and, having the place itself be a mystery or contain a mystery, and then the ability to understand it in a new way by having moved through it and discovered what it contains. And I think that there is, that's an experience you can have in real life. But it's rare to really, just sort of stumble upon one of those, experiences in life through happenstance where, you come across an abandoned house and then find out, what happened there and why it's abandoned or, something like that. I mean, I guess it's closer to the job of, like a crime scene investigator or something. But that's also a very different context. So there's this feeling, I think, of, games having a unique ability to create a space and allow the player to visit it and inhabit it and have it to themselves within that experience in a way that I think is pretty unique. And so I think what we focus on is how to, use mechanics and use what you find in the world to express that feeling, that satisfying feeling of saying, I used my own intuition and my kind of, skills as an investigator or just someone who's observant to, be a part of this place by reconstructing what it means by being in it. And that's something that, that ability of letting the player be somewhere and also be an active participant in what happens there enables the kind of, investigation games that we make.
Yeah. And it reminds me, when you're saying about sort of participation and kind of investigation, there's quite a famous GDC talk by Ken Levine, and he's talking about, there's three different kinds of players in terms of how they digest the story. There's the ones that don't care. There's the ones that will kind of just go along for the ride, and then there's the ones that will really dig deep and try to uncover everything. So
Right.
From what you're saying, are you kind of explicitly only aiming at that third kind of the player, the one that you have to be that kind of player in order to enjoy the kind of games that you make?
I would say it's more like the second two kinds, where, if you just don't care what is going on in the story layer whatsoever, then there's really not a lot of reason to be involved with what we do. But we do still try to tune the games so that if you are just following the breadcrumbs and finding the stuff that is the least hidden, that stuff adds up to the spine of the story. It adds up to the critical information that you need to understand at least, the kind of top level story. And especially in Gone Home, I used very, similar techniques that I, learned from working on the Bioshock series to organize that information, which is to say, Sam's story was like, the one that was told by the audio diaries was kind of quote unquote the story of the game. It was at least the central story of the game. And so the intent was just through, level design techniques to say, like, if you go into a room and you're at least basically, observant of what's in it, it'll be easy to find the things that will give you the audio diaries in basically an understandable order, so that if you're not, digging deep, you're still like, oh, I played from the beginning to the end and I know what happened. And that was cool, and that was satisfying. And then for the third kind of player you're talking about, everything else that you could find that's more hidden, but that also, if you miss it, it doesn't detract from the main story, will instead add to it and give you access to additional storylines that you might not have been aware of, and all that kind of stuff. And so hopefully, I think that the goal is to make the experience satisfying for a player who only gets the stuff that is the most gettable, and then to make the player who digs deeper and tries to find everything feel like doing that was worth it. Because there's certainly some games where you can be like, oh, I put in extra effort to try to find out more, and they let me do that, but then what I find doesn't really give me anything, so why did I do that? And hopefully the inverse is true in Gone Home, where it's like, if I choose to dig deeper, I'm glad I did, but if I don't, I haven't been totally blocked out of the experience.
Yeah. So when you're actually coming to some of the comments that players make of that sort, in terms of, I dug deep, but it wasn't worth digging. You often kind of get the sense that it wasn't worth digging in. I'm not going to name any games, but you often get the sense that it's not worth digging in those games because that extra content seems like an afterthought. It's just literally been added in there at the end to kind of give those kind of players something to do.
Right.
But it doesn't feel like that in your game. So what's the writing process there? Is it every single element in the game is written and designed as a whole, or do you do the kind of the core story first and then have little threads that come off of it that you add on afterwards?
I mean, that's a good question. I think that it happens in an iterative way. We definitely, well, what do you think about it? In general, we're thinking first about what the main story is. But there isn't much that goes into our games that happens kind of like all at once, like all the way through to completion, and then go back and do stuff, to like do another full. So it's not like, okay, let's do the entire whole main story. Okay, now that's done. Let's go back and add stuff to it. I think it's more, let's figure out what the events are in the main story, and why they're happening and how that relates to the characters. Okay, now that we know what the main story beats are, we need to think about how to actually express that to the character and how to support that with more stuff you find. So you're like, oh, if this happens, how is the player going to know that? We can put this thing that they find and this piece of audio, and they'll see this, and now they'll know that that happened. And a lot of times what's interesting is that's what leads to additional story threads that then you have to support further, where you're like, I don't know, with Gone Home, there was a lot of stuff where we started with a fact. We started with something like, okay, the family that's like this suburban family lives in this big sprawling mansion. So why'd that happen? Why is the game set here? Why are these people? We decided these kind of people would be here. Now, why are they here? And that led to a lot of the specifics of the highest level story of the game, which was just like, here's your teenage sister and she falls in love, and that leads to conflict. But we're like, okay, but why is it in this house? Why is it happening to these people? And, we're like, okay, well, if they inherited it from their uncle, that's cool. But why did they inherit it from their uncle? And who was he? And it seems like this house is like up in isolation on a hill. So maybe, it has some sort of stigma attached to it. And so, like now you're like, okay, well, if the townspeople were kind of suspicious of him, how do we make the player know that, so that now Sam has this kind of like, cloud hanging over her with the kids at school, but also it makes Lonnie think she's cool and interesting, so it brings them together. So that's cool. Okay, so that's all great. How do we put that in front of the player? And then also why is there this like, this stigma from the town to the uncle? What's the backstory for that? And so I think that it's finding the important points, finding the main points, and then just starting to ask the questions about, like, if we've decided that that is one of the things that happened, why did it happen, and how do we get that across to the player, and then continuing to build from there. I think that's true in Tacoma as well, where we say, this event happened at this point in the story. So what are the characters talking about that gets that across? And then from there, since we're only seeing these snippets of what happened, how do we further support what dialogue and what events are happening within the active scenes with documents and with things that you find in the characters' bunks and all that kind of stuff. But it does start from just like, what happened? How do we get that across in the most straightforward way? Now, how do we support what we put in front of the player to get the main point across with all the other stuff they find? It just builds in layers as we go, as opposed to being kind of like, here's the monolithic central story. Now let's add some additional threads, like in parallel to it.
Yeah. It's interesting. It sounds like, it's the design is just as much as anything else, being able to figure out what the right questions are that you need to ask yourself in order to create which is kind of an interesting, not mirror. It's sort of like the inverse of what you're asking the player to do, I suppose.
Right.
You're kind of getting the player to answer or find answers to a lot of these questions.
Well, I think it comes from, like I'm on larger teams. I was a level designer, and I think it comes from a very kind of level design mindset of the level designer on a team is the one who is closest to the moment-to-moment player experience. Like gameplay programmers are creating, how various systems work, and gameplay designers are tuning how the weapons work, or, that kind of stuff. And, all the different people on the team are building a lot of what the game is made of, but then the level designer's job is to place those things in front of the player and say, okay, now when the player walks through this door, these enemies are going to do these things, and then I introduce this new power, and this is how, when they get the power, they're going to understand what it does. And, kind of being in the player's shoes and having to ask those questions of like, okay, if we have this player power that has these abilities, and we need to get the player to understand what they are and why it's like cool or useful to use them, I can't just like put it in the middle of the floor and be like, good luck. How do we, if I'm the player, how do I walk in and see the power pickup and then pick it up and then see something else and be like, oh, I should do this. And then when I do it, I'm like, oh, I get how this works. And that was awesome. I should do it again. And I think that it's a similar thing, you know, where you are kind of working backwards, like you said, where you're sort of like, okay, I know that I want the player to end up understanding this thing about the story or this thing about the characters. And with the mechanics or the elements of the game that we have, how can I put this and this and this in front of the player so that when they encounter it, they'll say like, oh, I understand this about the story and this about the characters. And that can, you know, come down to something like, you know, very, very fiddly, like in Gone Home, the scene in the dining room that's about Sam coming out to her parents. There's the gameplay scripting, the events that fires off of is you go to the dining room table and you open up a school folder and there's 2 documents in it. There's one letter from the parents to Sam and there's one, I think it's like a note that is Sam getting sent home because she was suspended. And my gameplay scripting in that part says you have to click on both of them in total in either order. But it's saying like, okay, you've clicked on one, now you've clicked on the other. Now we'll play the audio diary. And it's that you know, player perspective thing of me saying like, well, I don't want you just to click one and then be trying to read the other one while the audio is playing. But also I want you to have both of these pieces of information before you hear the third one. And just kind of working through like, what are the things? What do you have to do to make this happen? How does that add up in the end to the understanding of the story or the context of the game that I, as the writer and designer, started from, and kind of meeting at that point where we have a shared understanding.
Yeah. So given the design that you've that you've gone through and gone home, and maybe also from the player side as well, that the player kind of understands what you're trying to do there, has that sort of pushed you to do more with Tacoma? Have you tried to push the envelope on that even more, and do things maybe not more complicated from the player side, but maybe more complicated in some design or narrative way? Has it encouraged you to do that now that you've kind of shown that kind of game does work, players can understand and really enjoy that game? Has it pushed you to do more, or do you not think about it in that very sort of linear progression kind of way?
Well, I think it's interesting because you got to play the Tacoma demo. I mean, I would be interested to hear what you think, because I think that what we're doing with the additional layer of the kind of nonlinear story sequences that you can move through does push in that direction. But did you feel that way?
Yeah, I did, and just the fact that you can. I need to play it more to really understand what I think about it, I suppose.
Sure.
But
sorry to put you on the spot.
No, just the idea that you can. Just the idea that it's real people that you're listening to, and the fact that you can kind of see them moving and stuff. There, it adds like a strong kind of emotional element to what you're seeing, and the fact that you can see different things in the same events but in different orders really does alter the emotional reading of that singular event, given that you're so explicitly exposed to it. More so than you are in Gone Home, because it's a more kind of abstracted, you're reading artifacts rather than listening to or watching the event itself. Yeah,
I mean, those were the two things that we wanted to get to with Tacoma. Like, one was getting the player closer to the events of the story. Like, I think that there's something, I think part of what was like powerful or successful about Gone Home was the fact that, you know, you had distance from the story. Like, you were hearing Sam's audio diaries, and they were very direct and personal, and you could kind of extrapolate, you know, kind of like a lot just came from, like, the fact that you were just picturing things from her voice, I think was important. But then the flip side of that is we don't want to just repeat ourselves. So, like, going the opposite direction and saying, okay, what if you could be in the room with these characters while these things were happening and be able to not just hear them, but observe their body language and how they related to each other, and kind of have that presence of standing next to them while these things are going on, and really kind of being there for them. But also through the, you know, both the in-fiction kind of technology, the augmented reality technology, and the actual game mechanic systems, be able to say, but you're not in the room with them. It isn't like a Walking Dead kind of thing where now, you know, you are choosing dialogue trees to, like, know, alter events. Instead, the fact that, again, you have that distance, that you're not really there, that you're in the space with representations of them, but after the events have already happened, gives you access to the second half of this, which is that we can create these scenes that are dense in a way, because each takes place over a relatively small amount of space, but also sprawling in the sense that there are these, you know, 6 characters that are all moving around independently, and you are able to follow any of them in any order that you choose. And like you were saying, when you come into one of these spaces and there are these characters that are all moving around independently, and you say, well, I'm going to follow character A, and you understand their perspective, and then you follow character B, and you understand their perspective, and then you follow the third character, that all 3 of them end up meeting up together, and your read on each of those moments is based on what you've chosen to engage with up to that point. And so I think and hope there's this interesting element of, because I chose to follow character B instead of A, and then did the inverse, I'm now like, oh, that thing that they were saying earlier has totally new context to it from what I just discovered, and kind of those eureka moments of building up to a whole picture of what happened, but within it saying, this is a kind of nonlinear knot of stuff that I'm untying, and there are these, like, mini revelations throughout it that, you know, you're saying, like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that was going on with them before they came into this conversation, and that colored what, you know, their reaction was, and all that kind of stuff. And so to that end, you know, Gone Home was a you know, traditionally level designed game where, you know, the point was to try to lead you from one audio diary to the next so that you get, you know, the story in the right order, and it all makes sense, and you're discovering it in a player driven way, but you're also being guided to it in a linear order by the designer. Tacoma is both more linear in some ways, i.e. we are unlocking sections of the station in order based on, like, the mission that the company that is employing you has laid out. But the flip side is that within each of those spaces, we say, you're free to come in here and explore the entirety of everything that is here in whatever order you choose. And all that's important is that it adds up to a whole that you are satisfied with and can move on from. I think there's something that is powerful about saying to the player, you know, we built this nonlinear piece of content and we've given you tools to see it from every angle, and now it's up to you to play that role, as opposed to, we've laid these breadcrumbs out in an order and we're going to, hopefully subtly or in a legitimate way, guide you along that path. But it's really up to you to, be observant while you follow along, instead of saying, oh, well, now I'm going to go over here and I'm going to rewind time to this point and I'm going to see what was going on, because I feel like this must have been happening at the same time as this other thing, and you're kind of making those connections actively, and hopefully that's like a cool new feeling.
We're only halfway through, so we hope you're enjoying our chat with Steve Gaynor. We'd just like to take a moment to introduce you to Independent by Design, art and stories of indie game creation, which is perfect for those wanting to delve deeper into games, game creators, and game design. It's a hardback book that tells the inside story of some of the world's best game studios and their games. It's informed by tens of hours of original interviews and is loaded with pages of artwork and concept and design documents. 26 studios and individuals are included, such as the Chinese Room, creators of Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and Dear Esther, Tom Francis, who gave us Gunpoint, and Lucas Pope of Papers, Please fame. You just need to go to indiebydesign.net to get your copy today. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook and YouTube at Indie by Design, and our website, as well as being a portal through which to listen to our podcast and buy our book, is full of interesting editorial content for you to read. Again, that's at indiebydesign.net. We'd also like to remind you of our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/indiebydesign. Indie by Design is unfunded, so if you can support us, then that would be fantastic. We begin the second half of the show with Steve Gaynor discussing the moment-to-moment gameplay of his games and how they feed into and create the wider whole.
If there's a satisfying feeling of, the pieces falling into place as you explore these things, then hopefully that makes it a worthwhile experience. I mean, I feel like that's a lot of what there are certain there are high level experiences with a game where you're like, overall, the full story of the game or the overall arc of the game or the feeling over hours of kind of like leveling up if you're in an RPG or something like that, is good or bad or satisfying or, whatever. But then there's the moment to moment experience of saying like, oh, and, killing this enemy is really satisfying because I had this one, enemy encounter, and it was really, I like that thing that happens in that moment, and then it adds up to the larger thing. And I think that, with a lot of games, that is kind of a very game mechanical or like audiovisual feedback based, kind of thing, where you're like, oh, it just feels good to play, or, when I got a drop on that enemy player in multiplayer and they didn't know I was there and I took them out, that was awesome. And that's the kind of moment to moment stuff. And so I think that in games like ours, those moment to moment kind of like spikes of engagement or of, feeling like the thing that's happening is satisfying within the larger arc is when you do find those pieces that click together, and that can be like in Gone Home, where, you see, and this is the very classic environmental storytelling thing of like, you see an object in the world and then you read a note and then you hear the audio diary and you're like, oh, now this audio diary makes that thing I saw in that note I read all make sense. And that's really satisfying, and that's been very set up by the designer, which is me in this case. That's been very set up by me to just say, okay, you'll click on this and then you'll hear this. And now you'll be like, oh, cool, or what have you. And in Tacoma, I hope that there's, our version of that is that, yeah, we kind of handed you these big, relatively big, kind of spread out moments, and you are having those kind of like dawning realization or click moments that are like, oh, because I saw this and then I heard them say that means that other thing I saw earlier, wait, I'm going to rewind and look at that again. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And you're kind of involved in that reconstruction in a more direct way, but that it leads to a similar kind of thing of you having those micro moments within the whole experience, saying like, oh, that's what he was talking about, or that's where he was going when he left the other place. Now I know why he seemed, mad or something when he was coming into the scene earlier, and kind of having those points where you have been the kind of medium for those moments lining up and adding up to something bigger. it's just interesting to think of the parallels between those kinds of micro moments and something like, whatever, getting a sweet headshot in Call of Duty or something. It's like you can't have the big picture without those little moments in between, and finding ways that the mechanics and the content add up to those kinds of little revelations in a game like ours is kind of interesting to feel our way into.
Yeah. So is that how you go about it? That you think about it in the small moments, and then work into the bigger thing? I mean, it sounds like a very there's like an understanding in, like, stoicism and things like that. That if the big picture is kind of making you upset and you can't see how to progress, then you look at each individual tree rather than the whole forest, and then you can work out how to progress. Is that typically how you kind of process things in your mind in that way?
Well, I mean, I think that it has been harder for me and Carla so Carla Zamanja is my story partner and my studio co-founder, and we've had to learn how to write a new kind of story for us with Tacoma. Like, we were very grateful to get to learn how to build the kind of story that we made in Gone Home from working on the Bioshock series and being put in charge of the Minerva's Den DLC for Bioshock 2, and kind of having a really clear model for how to get that shape of story across to the player, and being able to translate that from a big game like Bioshock into a smaller game that's totally focused on those aspects like Gone Home. And so the harder part for us is, when you change the mechanics of the game, as we have in Tacoma, when we say, okay, this is actually an ensemble story, and it's about being in these big moments that everyone's involved in, and it's about the player being able to be inside of those moments in kind of an organic, nonlinear way. All of that means that we can't tell the same kind of story that has the same shape because we're not telling it in the same way. And I think that we had those kinds of moments that you're describing where we're like, okay, we can't solve this in one big heroic kind of like, let's look at the entire problem and solve the whole thing. I think that, we did have to kind of go back and forth and say, okay, if this has to be about the whole crew, we need to kind of like audit what we actually have. And that's to say, this game with the mechanics that we have, it can't be about one character being the most important character and everybody else being supporting characters, because everybody is equally in these scenes. So what kinds of moments lend themselves to being expressed in these ways? Okay, so how then do we write a story or build a story that is about all of these characters being important to it, instead of there being the one important character like Sam or like Porter in Minerva's Den and everything else supporting that? And so we had to look at more examples that were outside of what we had already worked on, to see what are ensemble stories that are meaningful examples for us. It's obviously, you can look at things like Alien, that has a crew on this stage or on this ship, and they're all kind of in this, they have to deal with this crisis together. I looked at things like The Wire, where, theoretically, at least in the first season, McNulty is like the main character of The Wire. But then in the second season, he's hardly even in it. And then in the third and successive seasons, it's really very spread out between all of the characters. And just looking at all these examples of what are stories that we can think of that, we respect and appreciate, and that also are some guideposts for how do we make something that is about multiple characters' perspective and how they all contribute to the viewer or the player's understanding of the plot in total that's affecting all of them. And so I think it's like you're saying, where we had a big problem that we were just like, what story are we writing and how does it relate to what we're doing? And we had to look at the individual aspects of it and say, like, well, what about the way that we know how to work doesn't apply to what we're doing? And what is here instead? And what's that similar to? And then how can we find examples and points of reference for ourselves to be able to understand what the individual elements of what we actually need to do are, so we can start building towards those. And so, it is very much that kind of like break it down, try to understand it piece by piece, build it back up into the thing that it needs to be kind of processed. Because if it's too big and too, kind of like overwhelming from the zoomed out, the forest perspective, it's really hard to get a grasp on it.
Yeah. And this is changing the subject slightly, but it does kind of follow on. It's interesting that you mentioned that your examples there that you're looking at with ensemble pieces are from film and television. Mm-hmm. And it kind of reminds me of, you wrote a blog post about 10 years ago, in 2008, in which you kind of made a bet with the world, I suppose. As to you, and your bet was that video games wouldn't ever attract the same level of cultural impact or cultural discourse as novels or films. And I'm just wondering, what was it that kind of inspired you to write that? Was it a dissatisfaction or a frustration with games? And now, 10 years on, do you still think the same things, or has your mind been changed or influenced in another way?
I don't know. It's hard. Yeah. It's still a complex subject, I guess. There's a lot of kind of like founders syndrome that happens in any space, in any creative space, cultural space. I think the comparison for me was that, games feel like they live in a similar space to comic books, which they started as this, very pulpy medium that was aimed at adolescents. And in a lot of cases, they've grown, and there have been examples of, great work that has kind of more, nuance to it or whatever that you can point to, whether it's, The Watchmen or Chris Ware's work or, Mouse, or take your pick, right? There's there are examples. But there's the overarching identity of the medium that's like, okay, but, if you walk into a comic shop, it's still, that's not the identity of the medium. The identity is still kind of where it came from. And you can point to saying like, well, but now everyone's a comic fan because superhero movies are the most popular, like profitable movies in the world. And it's sort of like, well, that's using stuff that comics built to expand or to reinforce or benefit film as a medium, right? Like I don't think that, relatively speaking, numbers wise, there's a ton of conversion from people being like, I went and saw the Avengers and now I go down to my comic shop every week and, read all the comics, right? It's more like, no, movies have become stronger from taking what comics had built and turning it into movies. And so anyway, long story short, I guess I feel like, I think that games are in this space where more than ever, we're seeing a lot of breadth and a lot of, interesting examples of stuff that is further outside of what games have traditionally done. And that's really cool. And that's really great. But it's still kind of a subset of what games are. And it's sort of like the two sides of it are that, like, that's fine. And that's not even really like a criticism, but it's also kind of true, that it's sort of like, okay, if you're trying to work outside of the traditional expectations, it's still going to be kind of like something you have to search for within games, as opposed to something that they present themselves as outwardly. And it's really interesting in a way because, like, I feel like I'm in a good place to be conversant with that whole dynamic in terms of, I'm a fan of, I'm like I'm a traditional gamer. I don't know. I came up playing PC games and console games, and I still play, tons of AAA games, and all the stuff that's out there. I think that it's really true of any indie developer practically, that we're all playing all the stuff that everybody's playing, and also trying to push further outside of the boundaries of what's already been done. And I think it's kind of really important to straddle that line and be able to say, even if I'm making something that isn't exactly like, big, high budget games, I know what those things are, and I both know what players who play them, which is like practically all the players who are going to play our games. I know what their, what expectations or what perspective they're taking from those and bringing to our games. And also, design is design, and a really clever solution to a design problem in a AAA game doesn't have to be expensive. You know what I mean? Like, if you see like, oh wow, okay, actually that's a really great way to get this concept across to a player through this like UI, technique, I could apply that to my game. Like, that's also the kind of thing where big games and small games are talking to each other. But I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things that is, I guess, maybe interesting to think about when you're, not really in the industry yet, and you're younger, and you're blah blah blah. In terms of like, oh, are games ever going to be respected or whatever? And it's sort of like, you don't have control over it. All you have control over is whether you can be comfortable working within the frame that is there and trying to, do what you want within it. Because you aren't going to be able, like, you aren't going to be able to say like, now games are respectable, like, or whatever. And you can't, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I mean, I think the only thing that matters about it is, you want people who would be interested in what you're doing to be able to have access to it. And I think that's maybe kind of the worry, right? Is if you're doing a comic book that's really personal and, like, might appeal to people who would never normally walk into a comic shop, they have to walk into a comic shop to have access to it, or into the comics section of a big bookstore, or, whatever, search it specifically, or just hear about it. And, it's the same kind of thing where it's sort of like, well, if we're making something that someone who doesn't normally kind of work within this space and understand, like, what they have access to through video games, that there's just going to be fewer people who might be able to, like, enjoy the thing you're making and engage with it to actually get at it, in a way that is kind of low friction. People who are more of like traditional gamers like me, who are just like, well, I have a Steam account. I know where to, I bought a PlayStation, whatever, an Xbox. I know where to get this stuff. I know that, these kinds of things are in there along with these other kinds of things. And I kind of like have internalized that space, have access to more of that stuff. But if you're sort of like, well, I'm a person who might be interested in XYZ, indie games or other games that aren't in that traditional space, like, the path there is just longer because you're not already nearby. And it's sort of like, I think that's the one practical aspect of the consideration of the argument, is just being like, it's a shame if there are people who might be interested in what we're doing who just don't even know it's there or how to get to it, because you kind of already have to be in the game sphere to really even have awareness or access.
Yeah. Do you think any of that is related to kind of the comparative youth of games, and that maybe when sort of like the gatekeepers to putting it out into the more mainstream spheres, in the same way that film is recorded and critiqued and whatever else in, say, daily national newspapers and other sorts of genuinely mass media avenues, and maybe when people of the sort of gaming generation take up those positions as the editors of those things, do you think maybe games will come into that sphere more and be, because the people in charge will see it as a normal part of their everyday kind of media sort of mix?
I mean, yeah, I think to some degree, and I think we're already seeing that, right? You know, I mean, I think that there's way more mainstream coverage of games that are coming out, whether they're big games or small games, and I think that's interesting and cool and good. And I think, you know, just like references to game stuff in popular culture is way more common now. I mean, it's funny to be, you know, getting older and be like, okay, if I watch like a comedy special on, you know, TV, or if I, you know, engage with any kind of like, you know, thing like that might have like pop culture references or stuff like that in it, that like I'm the same age as the people who are making this stuff or older at this point, you know, and it's just sort of like you're watching something and the people in it are just like making offhand references to Mario Kart or something, and it's just sort of like, that's weird. It's cool. Like, it's just funny to be like, oh, right. I'm now of a generation where everybody else who's making stuff is going to talk about, you know, what, like, if they're talking about their childhood, they're going to talk about how they were playing Pokemon, you know, with their friends or whatever, right? And you're just sort of like, everybody does have that shared reference point, especially of the big stuff. And it doesn't have to be explained. And it is just kind of part of what's in the water in a cool way. But, you know, I think that there's still kind of that fall off aspect as well, where it's like, well, how many people have kept up with it, and how many people are, you know, becoming aware of when a really interesting small game comes out? And I think that for more of the time, it's accessible to the people who are already invested. And I think that kind of theoretically the desire is to be able to allow more people to either, you know, hang on or find their way back in, because there's enough interesting stuff that is worth sticking around for, that, you know, they aren't gonna kind of, you know, bail out and miss more good interesting things when they come around. But, you know, whatever. It's all theoretical, really. You know, the audience is growing all the time, and indie games are, you know, actually able to be like a sustainable thing to make if you're lucky. And that's way different than it was like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So, you know, there are things that are certainly moving in a good direction.
Yeah. And this, you know, I don't want to get too kind of, you know, airy fairy and whatever, but I wonder how much when you first decided that you were going to be a games designer, that this is what you're going to dedicate your sort of creativity towards and your career towards and much of the time that makes up your life towards. Well, it was your feelings on the sort of the potential of games and the sort of lack of that influence that they'd had over culture and compared to other things, was that an influence was that like a driving force behind you wanting to be in part of games, and a driving force behind the kinds of games that you wanted to create? So was that kind of, were you trying to, is there any part of your designs that are setting out to kind of bring games into that
Well, I
That
mean,
cult.
yeah, I guess I would say that one conscious thing that I, thought about. So when I didn't really realize that I wanted to and might be able to, make games as the thing that I did for my career until I was in college. And there, I was taking a lot of film courses and drawing comics and writing comics. And I was in, an art program doing like illustration and stuff like that more than anything. And those were the directions that I was going in. But then, my notebooks of like stuff that was supposed to be like comics ideas or whatever started turning into all like game ideas and game design ideas and stuff. And at some point I realized like, well, it seems like what I actually want to be doing is like making games and not this other stuff, because that's, what my brain is trying to tell me. And so within thinking about that, I was, like, okay, well, comics have been around for, depending on your view of them, for hundreds or more years, but in the form that they're in now for more than 100 years, as has film. And it's certainly not like there isn't innovation to be done in those media, certainly, but like games are so much younger and have so much more unexplored territory in them that I certainly, had that thought of saying like, well, yeah, if making games is going to be what I'm going to do, there's a lot more that has, never been done at all yet in games that they could be capable of, than a lot of other media that you could be working on. And that was definitely like, that was exciting and interesting to me to be able to say like, I love when I play a game and I feel like it's doing something I've never seen before. And the opportunity to do that in games is kind of like all out there. And that's really cool. And then, from my own just personal kind of aesthetic thrust or whatever, yeah, being able to say like some of the boundaries that games, haven't crossed very much or are much less common to see in games is like the ability just to talk about people that you might know, or things that are just sort of mundane and might happen to anybody, and make that part of what you're experiencing. And it's certainly not like it's never been done before or anything, but it's rare and exciting when you see something in a game that you're like, this feels so familiar. This is like something that could have just happened to me, because games are so good at the opposite of saying like, this is so crazy. This world is like something I've never seen before, which is awesome. But using the inverse to give you new access to things that feel familiar through a different lens, I think is just as inspiring. But it all comes down to that ability potentially to be able to say like, what can we do with games that hasn't been done? And there's still like an incredible amount of that left out there for sure.
For more on games and game creators, visit indiebydesign.net and follow us on Twitter @indiebydesign. The Indie by Design podcast is brought to you by the writers and creators of Independent by Design, art and stories of indie game creation. Episodes are released weekly on Wednesdays, with our patrons via patreon.com/indiebydesign getting access to additional content. Music is kindly provided by Ben Prunty.